She said something to you. Maybe weeks ago, maybe last night. And something in you went quiet. Just for a moment, before you talked yourself out of it. You probably told yourself you were overreacting, or that she was just stressed, or that what she said didn't really mean what it felt like it meant. And so you let it go. You moved on. And life continued the way it always does, forward, without resolution. Here is what I want you to understand before we go any further. The reason you talked yourself out of that quiet moment is not weakness. It is not naivety. It is something far more specific than that. Most men have never been given a framework for hearing certain phrases, a way of recognizing what they actually signal beneath the surface. So when those phrases arrive, they get processed as arguments, or moods, or misunderstandings. They get managed. They get absorbed. And they are never identified for what they really are. There are 5 things a woman can say to a man that function as structural warnings. Not insults. Not obvious red flags. Quiet, reasonable-sounding phrases that carry a hidden architecture. One designed, not always consciously, to keep you uncertain about your own perception. By the end of this video, you will be able to hear each of them clearly, not with anger, not with suspicion, but with the kind of calm recognition that changes everything. Of all the things a woman can say, this one is the most quietly effective, because it doesn't attack you. It just makes you doubt your own reading of the room. Think about the last time you expressed discomfort about something. A tone she used, a comment that landed wrong, a moment that didn't sit right with you. Now think about what happened next. If what happened next was a conversation about what you noticed, that is one thing. But if what happened next was a redirection, if the conversation moved away from what you felt and toward the question of whether your feeling itself was valid, that is something else entirely. "You're too sensitive" does not address what you observed. It relocates the problem. It takes whatever you noticed and places it inside you as a flaw, rather than engaging with it as information. And the reason this is so effective is that it arrives wearing the costume of honest feedback. It sounds like she is helping you see something about yourself. It can even feel, in the moment, like she cares enough to be direct with you. But there is a distinction that matters enormously here. There is a version of this kind of feedback that is genuinely useful. A woman who loves you and knows you well might, at certain moments, gently point out that you are reading a situation through an old wound rather than clearly. That is real intimacy. That is someone who sees you. The phrase we are talking about is not that. The phrase we are talking about is a pattern, one that appears consistently whenever you bring something uncomfortable to the surface. Now you might be wondering, couldn't she just have a point sometimes? And yes, of course, context always matters. One instance proves nothing. But when this phrase arrives reliably, specifically when you are expressing something that would require her to be accountable, that is the detail that changes everything. What most men do in this moment is turn inward. They begin reviewing the way they brought up the concern, the tone they used, the timing they chose, the words they picked. They start debugging their own delivery instead of staying with what they originally felt. And by the time they finish that review, the original concern has been forgotten entirely. That is the moment most men walk away from without realizing it. That phrase works by turning your perception inward. The next one works differently. It turns your history against you. A disagreement about facts is normal. 2 people remember things differently. That's human. But there's a specific pattern that goes beyond that, and once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. Memory between 2 people in a relationship is not a simple record. It is a living thing, shaped by emotion and perspective and the needs of the moment. So when 2 people recall an event differently, that alone is not alarming. What matters is what happens when those 2 recollections collide. In a healthy dynamic, the response is curiosity, a genuine attempt to understand how the other person experienced what happened. In the pattern we are talking about, The response is something different. The response is correction. Firm, calm, consistent correction of your version of events. I never said that. That's not what happened. You're remembering it wrong. What these phrases do, individually, is raise a reasonable question about accuracy. But what they do cumulatively, over months, over years, is something far more significant. Psychologists refer to this as gaslighting, which is the systematic undermining of a person's trust in their own perception of shared reality. I want to give you a plain language description of what this actually feels like from the inside. You begin to second-guess yourself before you even speak. You start mentally rehearsing your recollection of events, building a case, gathering evidence, before raising anything, because you have learned that your memory will be challenged. And then, slowly, you stop raising things altogether. Not because nothing bothers you, but because you no longer trust your own record of what happened. Here is the specific, observable detail that distinguishes this pattern from ordinary disagreement. It is not that she remembers things differently in all directions, sometimes favoring your version, sometimes hers, the way genuine human memory works. It is that the corrections move consistently in one direction. Her recollection always holds. Yours is always the one in question, always the one that needs adjusting. Of course, there are women who genuinely have sharper memories, and there are men who genuinely do misremember. I am not asking you to distrust your partner by default. I am asking you to notice the pattern of direction, because that pattern is the signal. What most men do when they encounter this consistently is begin to defer. They stop insisting on their version not because they have been persuaded, but because the cost of holding their ground has simply become too high. And deference, over time, becomes the shape of the relationship. Before we move to the next phrase, there is one additional layer to this that most explanations skip entirely. The reason this pattern is so hard to identify in real time is that it always comes wrapped in calm certainty. She does not seem to be lying. She seems genuinely sure. And her certainty, delivered quietly, begins to feel more credible than your own uncertainty. That gap, between her confidence and your doubt, is precisely where the pattern lives. When a woman rewrites the past consistently, it changes how a man stands in the present. The third phrase takes advantage of exactly that weakened footing. This one is delivered so reasonably that most men respond by actually wondering if she's right. And that's precisely what makes it so effective. There is a version of comparison that is genuinely useful in a relationship. A woman might say, directly and specifically, that she needs more communication, or more consistency, or more of something particular. That is honest. That is navigable. That gives you something real to work with. The phrase we are examining is not that. The phrase we are examining is a comparison to an unnamed, unspecified, hypothetical other woman who would apparently not have this problem. Every other woman would be fine with this. Most women wouldn't make such a big deal out of this. My friends think I'm crazy for even being upset about this. What this phrase manufactures is inadequacy without a target. Because there is no specific behavior being asked to change. There is no clear request being made. There is only the implication that other versions of your partner, versions connected to other, better men, would be experiencing something smoother, easier, less complicated than whatever is happening between you right now. Behaviorally, this kind of comparative diminishment functions as a pressure mechanism. It does not invite growth. It invites shrinking. The man on the receiving end of this phrase does not walk away thinking about what he might genuinely improve. He walks away thinking about whether he is simply too much, too particular, too complex, too difficult to love at normal settings. Now, you might push back here. You might say, surely she is just expressing frustration. And sometimes, yes, frustration is real and the phrasing is simply poor. One instance of this, said in a heated moment, is probably exactly that. But when this kind of comparison becomes a recurring instrument, when it appears specifically in moments where you are asking for something or expressing a need. It is no longer venting. It is positioning. It is a way of making your needs feel like the unreasonable variable in an otherwise reasonable equation. What most men do is accept the framing. They begin to feel like the problem. They begin to minimize what they actually need in order to seem more agreeable, more low maintenance, more like the imagined other men who apparently don't require any of this. The comparison is not about other women. It never was. 3 phrases in, and you may be noticing a pattern. They all redirect. They all reframe. The 4th phrase is different. It doesn't redirect. It simply closes the door. Sometimes people need space. That's real and that's fair. But there's a version of this phrase that has nothing to do with needing space, and everything to do with who gets to decide what's allowed to be resolved. Emotional regulation is a real and legitimate need. There are conversations that are genuinely better had after a cooling period, when both people can think more clearly, speak more carefully, hear each other more accurately. I want to be precise about this, because what I am about to describe is not an argument against needing time. It is a description of something that wears the same clothing while functioning entirely differently. I'm done talking about this. Said once, in a moment of genuine overwhelm, that phrase is understandable. Said consistently, specifically at the point in a conversation where accountability would be required. It is something else. It is a mechanism. It is a way of terminating a process that was heading somewhere uncomfortable for her, under the cover of emotional need. Here is what this costs a man over time, and this is the part that matters most. He begins to pre-edit himself. Before he raises a concern, before he asks a question, before he names something that bothered him, he runs a calculation. Is this worth the shutdown? Is this conversation going to make it to resolution? Or is it going to be closed before it gets there? And slowly, across dozens of these calculations, he stops raising things. Not because nothing is wrong, but because the architecture of the relationship has taught him that certain conversations are simply not permitted to reach their natural end. The result is a man who has learned to be quiet about the things that matter most to him. He does not feel silence dramatically. There was no single confrontation, no obvious moment of suppression. It happened gradually, through the repeated experience of doors closing before he reached them. That is the difference between a woman who needs time and a woman who uses time as a closing mechanism. One reopens the conversation. The other never does. What most men do here is respect the stated need without ever recognizing the pattern beneath it. They give her the space. They wait. They bring it up again softly. And when it gets closed again, they begin to wonder if they are the ones being unreasonable for continuing to need resolution. Remember what I told you at the very beginning, that there are phrases most men not only miss but actively process as something ordinary. We are arriving at the last one now, and this is the one I want you to sit with most carefully. The first 4 phrases you can hear in a single argument. The 5th one is different. It doesn't arrive in a fight. It arrives in a quiet moment, and it sounds almost like love. This one is the hardest to hear as a warning, because on the surface, it sounds like she wants more intimacy. She doesn't. She wants less accountability. Think back to a moment that once seemed tender. A moment where she said something that felt, at first, like closeness. Like an expression of how much she expected from you because she valued you that much. If you really loved me, you wouldn't need to ask. Or perhaps it arrived as, if I have to explain it, it doesn't count. Or, you should just know. I want you to understand what this phrase is doing structurally, because it is the most sophisticated of the 5. Every relationship involves a gradual process of learning each other, learning what matters to the other person, what they need, what they value, what causes them pain. That learning is never complete. It is always ongoing. A secure, functional relationship creates room for that process. Room to ask, to clarify, to occasionally get things wrong and adjust. The phrase we are examining collapses that room entirely. It declares that genuine love is expressed through intuition alone, that asking is evidence of not caring, that needing guidance is evidence of not knowing her, that making a request is evidence of emotional distance rather than honest communication. What this teaches a man over time is to stop asking for what he needs, because asking has been framed as failure. Needing clarity has been framed as not loving her enough. And so he begins to operate in permanent inference, constantly reading, constantly guessing, constantly trying to divine the right response without the information that would actually allow him to provide it. Now, you might be thinking, some women genuinely want to be known that deeply. And yes, the desire to be truly seen and understood by a partner is real, and it is beautiful. But there is a profound difference between a woman who wants to be known and a woman who uses the language of being known to avoid ever being held to a clear standard. Because when nothing is ever explicitly stated, when love must be demonstrated only through perfect intuition, she is never wrong. She can always say, afterward, that you should have known, that if you had really been paying attention, that if you truly cared. You cannot be accountable to a standard that is never clearly articulated. And that, precisely, is the point. Here is the observable pattern that distinguishes this from genuine romantic depth. It appears specifically in moments where a direct request would make her vulnerable, where naming what she needs would require her to admit she has a need at all. It is not that she wants to be known intuitively in all things. It is that she wants the option to retroactively define what you should have done after the moment has passed, so that the standard always remains just beyond your reach. What most men do is accept the premise. They begin to feel like they are always slightly failing at love, not dramatically, not in ways that are easy to name, but chronically. Like they are perpetually one insight short of actually getting it right. And that feeling, that quiet, chronic inadequacy, is perhaps the most damaging thing any relationship can install in a man. That phrase is the architecture of the whole pattern made visible. Once you have seen it, the other four make a different kind of sense. 5 phrases, 5 different surfaces, one identical structure beneath all of them. Each of these things a woman can say targets a different layer of your self-trust. The first one targets your perception, what you notice. The second targets your memory, what you remember. The third targets your adequacy, whether what you need is reasonable. The fourth targets your voice, whether you are permitted to finish the conversation. And the fifth, the quietest and the most complete, targets your right to ask it all. That is not coincidence. That is a pattern, and a pattern can be named. I want to be clear about something before you take this into your life. Naming these phrases is not about suspicion. It is not about walking into your next conversation with a checklist and a closed heart. It is about something much simpler than that. It is about knowing what you are hearing in real time, so that the quiet moment, the one where something in you goes still, no longer gets argued away before you have had a chance to take it seriously. A man who can name what is happening to him is not a man who is on guard. He is a man who is present. There is a significant difference. You came into this video without a framework for these 5 phrases. You are leaving with one. That changes what is possible for you. Not because you now have a weapon, but because you now have clarity. And clarity, in the context of how we love and who we allow close to us, is perhaps the most underrated form of self-respect there is. Which of these 5 have you heard? And which one hit closest to home? Tell me in the comments because I read every single one. If this kind of specific, inside perspective insight is useful to you, the kind that goes beneath the surface of behavior and into the psychology behind it, then stay close to this channel. Every video is built around giving you the real picture, not the simplified one. Next, I'm going to show you the 5 things a woman does when she's already emotionally left. No words, no arguments, just silence and small signals that most men completely miss until it's too late.